All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're taking a deep dive into bicameralism and presentment, those cornerstones of how laws get made here in the U.S. These concepts are all about making sure no single branch of government holds all the power when it comes to lawmaking. It's a bit like a recipe, actually. To get a law, cooked and served, it needs to go through a specific process, a specific set of steps. And Congress is kind of like the chef in this scenario, carefully prepping all the ingredients. That's where bicameralism comes in. Both the House and the Senate got to agree on what goes into the dish. But then we got another key player at the table, right? The president. They're the ones who decide if the final dish is ready to be served or if it needs to be sent back to the kitchen for some tweaking. That's presentment. We're going to unpack some major Supreme Court cases where these principles were really put to the test. Like what happens when Congress tries to sidestep the president with a legislative veto, or when a president gets a little too creative with a line item veto. To help us break it all down, I got our expert here with us. So from the court's perspective, what are some of those core principles they consider when they're deciding these cases?
Well, the Constitution lays out a very clear process for making laws. The Supreme Court's job is to ensure that everyone sticks to that process, that recipe, you could say. It's about making sure that no single branch of government is overstepping its boundaries.
Right, so no one's going rogue in the kitchen. So let's unpack these concepts one by one, starting with bicameralism.
Bicameralism boils down to the structure of Congress. We have two chambers. You've got the House of Representatives and the Senate. Both of them need to give their approval before a bill can become law. It's a system of checks and balances within Congress itself.
So one chamber can't just be like totally gung-ho about a law and ram it through, right? They need that broader support, that consensus. What was the thinking behind that structure, historically speaking?
The framers of the Constitution were concerned about concentrating too much power in any one body. They wanted to ensure that lawmaking was a deliberate and thoughtful process with different perspectives represented.
Makes sense. And then we have presentment. What's the significance of that step in the whole lawmaking process?
Presentment is that final hurdle for a bill. Once both the House and the Senate have passed a bill, it goes to the president's desk. They then get to decide whether to sign it into law or use their veto power.
The president has a lot of power in that scenario.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the historical context for that and what some of the consequences of that presidential authority are?
The framers knew they needed a strong executive, but they also wanted to prevent any kind of tyranny. That's why they gave Congress the power to override a presidential veto. They need a supermajority vote to do it, though. A pretty high bar to clear. It's a necessary safeguard, though.
Okay, so those are our foundational ingredients: bicameralism and presentment. Now let's dig into some Supreme Court cases that really tested these principles, starting with INS v. Chadha. That was a case where Congress tried to, they tried to completely bypass the president. Right. What exactly happened there?
In INS v. Chadha, Congress tried to create what they called a legislative veto. Basically, they wanted to give one chamber of Congress the power to overrule a decision made by the executive branch, specifically about deportation. It was like they were trying to sneak in a secret ingredient without the chef's approval.
That does sound like a bit of a power grab. How did the Supreme Court react to that?
They were not happy about it, let me tell you. The Supreme Court saw this legislative veto as a clear violation of both bicameralism and presentment. Remember, both chambers have to agree, and the president has to play their role. By trying to skip those steps, Congress was going way beyond its constitutional authority.
What would have happened if the Supreme Court had allowed that, had let Congress use this legislative veto? What were the potential consequences there?
If they had upheld the legislative veto, it could have really shifted the balance of power. Congress would have had a lot more power, and it could have made things a lot messier, a lot less efficient.
Interesting. So with Chadha, the court was basically saying no shortcuts when it comes to making laws.
Exactly. And actually, that decision ended up invalidating hundreds of these legislative veto provisions that had been added to different laws over the years. It was a huge ruling that really reinforced the importance of sticking to that constitutional process.
Now let's switch gears and look at a situation where the president tried to exert a little more control over the legislative process. Clinton v. New York. This one involves something called the line item veto, which sounds a bit like a chef picking out ingredients they don't like from the dish. Can you walk us through this case?
In the late 1990s, Congress passed the Line Item Veto Act. It gave the president the power to cancel specific parts of spending bills without having to veto the whole thing. President Clinton used this power a few times to strike down certain spending provisions.
Sounds like that could lead to some some chaos in the kitchen. What were the arguments for and against giving the president that kind of power, and how did the court rule?
People who supported the line item veto argued that it gave the president more control over spending. They said it could help cut down on wasteful spending. Opponents argued that it messed with the balance of power and that it gave the president too much power to change laws that Congress had passed. The Supreme Court ended up siding with the opponents, ruling that the Line Item Veto Act violated the Constitution's presentment clause. They said the president can't just change or get rid of parts of laws that have already been enacted. It's all or nothing, approve the whole bill or veto the whole bill.
It sounds like the court was really trying to protect the legislative process and make sure laws are passed the right way, with both Congress and the president playing their roles.
You got it. The court recognized that it's really important to keep a clear separation of powers between the different branches of government. Each branch has to stay in its lane, so to speak, and no one gets to rewrite the recipe after it's been agreed upon.
So far, we've seen that both Congress and the president have tried to test the limits of their power in the lawmaking process. And the Supreme Court has been there to enforce the rules, reminding everyone how important bicameralism and presentment really are. Things get even more interesting when we start talking about how Congress tries to control executive officials. It adds another layer to this whole constitutional dance. But before we jump into that, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll explore the different ways Congress tries to influence the executive branch, from confirming appointments to using their power over the budget. Stick with us. All right, we're back and ready to dive into how Congress keeps those executive folks in check, making sure they're not, cooking up anything unconstitutional. Let's start with appointments. The president nominates people for all those important jobs, Rice. But what role does Congress play in that process?
Right. The president gets to pick who they want for positions like cabinet members, federal judges, but the Senate has the power to confirm or reject those picks. It's a really important way to check the president's power and make sure that a bunch of different voices are considered.
It's kind of like a taste test.
Yeah,
The president offers up a candidate, and the Senate gets to decide if they like the flavor.
I like that. That advice and consent role that the Senate has is a big deal. It helps shape the executive branch and make sure things are balanced.
Once someone's actually in one of these positions, does Congress have any say in what they do, how they do it?
That's where congressional oversight comes in. It's Congress's job to make sure that laws are being carried out properly and that tax dollars are being spent the right way. They've got several ways to do that: hearings, investigations, reporting requirements.
So Congress is constantly checking the oven, so to speak, making sure everything's cooking the way it should.
Exactly. And one of their main tools is the committee system, those groups of lawmakers we were talking about earlier.
Right, like the Judiciary Committee and the Finance Committee.
Yeah, those committees have a lot of power. They can call in witnesses, request documents, hold hearings to look into what the executive branch is doing. They can really put agency heads on the spot about their decisions, their spending, whether they're actually following the law.
They're like the kitchen inspectors, making sure everything is up to code. What happens if they find something's not right, though?
Well, they can issue reports criticizing what an agency's doing. They can propose new laws to clarify things, or even use their power over the budget to get agencies to change their behavior.
Ah, the power of the purse. That sounds pretty effective.
It is. Congress controls the money. They can use that power to give more money to agencies that are doing well, cut funding for those that aren't. They can even attach conditions to the funding, try to steer agencies in a specific direction.
So it's like saying, hey, if you want to keep using our ingredients, you better stick to the recipe.
You got it. It gives Congress a lot of leverage.
What about independent agencies, those groups that are supposed to operate independently from the president? How does Congress influence them?
That's a little trickier because their whole purpose is to be kind of separate from political pressure. But Congress still has some tools. Remember, they create those agencies in the first place, so they can decide how they're structured, what powers they have, what their goals should be.
So they set up the kitchen, draw the boundaries, so to speak.
Exactly. They can also use their oversight powers to keep an eye on them, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to, operating within the law, and of course, Congress still controls the money they get.
Sounds like Congress has a lot of ways to keep the executive branch in check, even those independent agencies.
They do. But it's important to remember that oversight isn't about micromanaging. It's about making sure things are transparent, that agencies are being accountable, that they're responding to the people.
It's about making sure the kitchen's running smoothly and that the final product, the laws and policies, are good quality and are actually working. It's a really interesting balance between letting the executive branch do its job and making sure they're not overstepping or going off recipe. We've talked a lot about Congress controlling the executive branch, but aren't there times when they have to work together?
All the time. In fact, a lot of the time, cooperation is the key to getting things done. We've talked about how they need to work together on appointments and the budget. But the biggest area of cooperation is the legislative process itself, how a bill actually becomes a law.
Okay, so that's the main course we've been saving for last, right? How Congress and the president, sometimes working together, sometimes butting heads, actually manage to get those laws made.
Oh,
Let's dig into that next, the ins and outs of the legislative process, the real test of how our system of government actually works. All right, welcome back to our deep dive, folks. We've been exploring how laws get made in the U.S., talking about bicameralism, presentment, the role of the Supreme Court. Now, for the main event, let's break down the legislative process itself, how a bill actually goes from an idea to a law, the whole journey. I imagine it's pretty complicated, like a recipe with a ton of steps and a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
Oh, it definitely is. Lots of moving parts and a lot of potential for things to go off the rails.
So let's start at the very beginning. Where does this whole legislative journey start?
With an idea, really. Anyone can have an idea for a law, a regular person, a lawmaker, an advocacy group, anyone. But to actually get that idea going, you need someone in Congress to take it on, introduce it as a bill.
So let's say I have this amazing idea, like making National Podcast Day a federal holiday. I need to convince one of my representatives or senators to, champion this very important cause.
That's exactly right. You got to sell them on it, make them see that it's a good idea and that people would support it.
Okay, so let's say I find someone who's willing to introduce my brilliant bill. What happens next? Does it just go straight to a vote?
Not so fast. The bill gets sent to a committee, a group of lawmakers who specialize in that area, like the Judiciary Committee or the Finance Committee.
Right. Those committees we were talking about before.
Those committees are really important in shaping the bill. They hold hearings, they get expert opinions, they debate whether it's a good idea, they might even suggest changes.
Sounds like the committee stage is where bills really get put through the ringer.
Yeah.
What happens if it survives that whole process?
If the committee approves the bill, then it goes to the full House or Senate for a vote. But here's the thing. This whole process, the committees, the debates, the votes, it all has to happen in both the House and the Senate.
So it's kind of like a basketball game where you have to win on both courts.
Exactly. And just like in basketball, sometimes the two teams, the House and the Senate, end up with slightly different versions of the bill.
Oh, so that's where things could get messy. What happens when the House and the Senate have different versions?
That's when they call in the conference committee. It's a group made up of members from both the House and the Senate. And their job is to work out those differences, find a compromise.
It's like a team huddle, trying to come up with a game plan that everyone can agree on.
Yeah, and if they can reach a compromise, that final version goes back to both the House and the Senate for one last vote.
And if both chambers say yes, then it's finally ready for.
Presentment, the big moment, the bill goes to the president's desk.
Right. That crucial step we talked about before. The president gets to decide, sign it and make it law, or veto it and send it back to Congress. But even if the president vetoes it, Congress still has a chance to override that veto, right?
They do. It's their last shot. If 2/3 of both the House and the Senate vote to override the veto, the bill becomes law even without the president's signature. It's tough to do, but it shows that in the end, the power to make laws belongs to the people's representatives.
Wow, what a process. From an idea to committees to debates to votes, maybe even a veto showdown, the whole thing is really complicated. But it's also fascinating to see how our system works, all the checks and balances, all the different players.
It's designed to be slow and careful, to make sure everyone's voice is heard and that the laws we end up with have broad support.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from bicameralism and presentment to the Supreme Court's role, congressional oversight, the whole legislative process.
We've seen how the framers of the Constitution set up this system to balance power, encourage debate, and ultimately make sure that laws reflect what the people want.
It's been a really interesting look at how laws get made, all the twists and turns, the power struggles, the compromises. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the heart of American lawmaking. Keep those braids working, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.